Okay, let me first apologize. I have no German, so I'm going to talk in English. And hopefully I've also got some slides, so that might help as well. First of all, let me say what an honor it is to be here, for you to ask me to speak on this occasion. I was very pleased to get the invitation, not just because it's an honor, but because before that I had, as part of my work on trying to understand the macroeconomics of the Eurozone and what was going on, I was seeing more and more very interesting and important papers that I was reading and citing, which came from this organization, IMK. And so when I got an invitation to speak here, I was very pleased to come. However, I'm slightly nervous because I'm going to do something which I always tell my students not to do. I always tell my students, do not answer the exam question that you would like to answer the exam question that's written on the paper. Perhaps the organizers expected me to talk about what was wrong with macroeconomic theory. What had the recent problems that we've experienced in the world told us that we could do better in terms of academic economists writing better theory? And I'm going to say that's the wrong question. So, although I tell my students not to do this, I hope you will indulge a rather elderly professor telling you what questions you should have asked. And the question I think you should ask is, in particular, in relation to what's been happening in the Eurozone over the last 10 years or more, the problem has not been the macroeconomic theory. The problem is that the policymakers have not been implementing the theory we already have. And I think too often the natural reaction to a macroeconomic crisis is to think, well, a macroeconomic crisis must mean we have bad macroeconomic theory. And I want to argue that maybe sometimes that is true, but sometimes it's not that simple. And to answer the question about why it might not be that simple, why sometimes perfectly good, well understood, generally agreed macroeconomic theory might be ignored by policymakers, we need to look at something I'll call the knowledge transmission mechanism, the difference between what academics do and understand and what policymakers do. Okay, perhaps before I begin, I just ought to say one thing about what I mean about generally understood macroeconomic theory. Harold has mentioned the blog. I do sometimes write about the Eurozone and what German macroeconomists say about what should happen in the Eurozone. And indeed, if you look at my readership, most of my readers come from the USA or the UK, but the third biggest country is Germany. And sometimes when I write about German macroeconomic views, I get comments back which saying, well, what you're saying is all very well from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, but Anglo-Saxon economics does not apply in Germany. I think that's a very sad point of view. Obviously, it's important to take account of national differences, but the kind of macroeconomics I'll be talking about today has universal applicability. It applies to all economies, and it certainly applies to the Eurozone. Okay. Let me just say what I mean about the knowledge transmission mechanism. We have academics, we have researchers trying to produce better theories that fit the data more precisely. We have policymakers, and let's be generous, let's assume they try and do the best thing given the way they think or are told the world works. But they generally don't directly ask academics. Policymakers don't normally ring me up and say, Simon, what should we do? Or indeed any of my colleagues. Generally, there are intermediaries between policymakers and academics. Those intermediaries are of various different kinds. Ones that come to mind immediately are civil servants, or people nowadays in think tanks are very important, maybe like the IMK. Paul Krugman has talked about policy entrepreneurs, and maybe I'm becoming a bit of a policy entrepreneur. They can be academics, but they're not necessarily doing research, but they're using the research of their colleagues to promote a policy point of view. We're familiar with those. I want to argue, in thinking about recent experience, we need to cast the net a bit wider. We need to think about economists working for financial institutions. We need to think about the media, and in particular, we've already talked about how journalists are becoming more and more stretched, and so they may know less and less about economics. But I want to argue for the developments in the last few years, we also need to think about central banks. Now, of course, central banks are policy makers when it comes to monetary policy. But when it comes to fiscal policy, which is what I want to talk about, they advise policy makers, they do not make policy. And I want to argue that their role has been quite important in the last few years. Okay. Now, I want to mainly focus on what's been happening over the last 10 years, but just to suggest to you that being interested in this knowledge transmission mechanism isn't just something that I dreamt up to think about recent events. I also want to try and convince you that that transmission mechanism has been important when looking at past economic crises. Now, perhaps the one exception here, and perhaps the one that we always think about, is the Great Depression. Now, I think a reasonable story for the Great Depression is that policymakers didn't have the right theory. They didn't understand that economies could have a lack of aggregate demand for prolonged periods of time, and that could generate persistent unemployment. They didn't have the theory that told them why that could happen. Keynes, the general theory, came along with that, and then policymakers could do better. So that very simple story that crises happen because of bad theory kind of fits the Great Depression. But a similar, very simple story is told for two other crises, the increase in inflation in the 1970s and also the financial crisis that we've just been through. And I want to argue that simple story doesn't really work. So let me first talk about the inflation of the 1970s. Now, a simple story that's often told is it was the wrong theory. The story is that academic economists had the idea there was a permanent trade-off between unemployment and inflation, that they could get a little bit more unemployment with just a little bit more inflation. That was the theory. Policymakers implemented that and tried to get a bit less unemployment, but instead they got accelerating inflation. And then Friedman, in 1968, in his presidential address, put theory to rights. He said there is a vertical long-run Phillips curve, and with a 10-year lag, policymakers realized the truth and started controlling inflation. Now, that story has a little bit of truth in it, but I think it's mainly wrong. You should worry about it, first of all, because of this lag. Why, when Friedman gave a very famous address in 1968, did it take 10 years before policymakers took this on board? That's a bit strange. But it's also a very US-centric story. If you think about Germany and for example, the Bundesbank never had the idea that there was a permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And as a result, they allowed much less of an increase in inflation than in the US and UK. So it's a rather narrow story if it's true for US and UK, but there's an important book by Forder that's just come out which shows that actually the story doesn't really apply even in the US or the UK. There was no consensus among academics that there was a long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. What there was instead was a widespread reluctance to believe in the Phillips curve at all, among policymakers, among people who advise policymakers, and to some extent among academics at all as well. And that reluctance to believe in any kind of Phillips curve, not just the wrong Phillips curve, led policymakers to ignore the implications of what they were doing with demand, but also to try and get round the problem, the implications of the Phillips curve, through direct controls on wages and prices, which turned out to be unsuccessful. So it's a much more complicated story than simply bad theory leading to bad policy. We come more up to date and talk about the financial crisis. There's again an attempt to tell a very simple story about how it was bad theory led to the crisis. And that simple story says macroeconomics had neglected the financial sector, their models didn't include the financial sector, and that meant these models ignored the possibility of a crisis and therefore failed to predict a crisis, and therefore we had a crisis. Now that story is also almost completely incorrect. What's correct is that macroeconomics did indeed ignore finance too much. That is certainly true. But the idea that the financial crisis happened because macroeconomists ignored finance, I think, is very difficult to believe. And there are lots of ways I could justify that argument, but let me just choose one. Since the crisis, there's been a lot of analysis by economists of how you avoid the crisis happening again. And I think one of the best studies, and one which pretty well most economists I talk to agree with, is a study by, or a book, in fact, by Marty and Hellwig called The Banker's New Clothes. And that says if you want to avoid the situation in which banks are too big to fail, then you must have much higher capital requirements for those banks. So not 4% or 5%, but something like 20%. Something like, in fact, more general firms have in terms of the amount of capital. And as I say, I think many economists would agree with that solution to avoid potential financial crises. But what's actually happening is that advice is being effectively largely ignored. Yes, capital requirements have gone up, but by 1% or 2%. And no one seriously thinks that's going to prevent another financial crisis happening. So if the advice of economists can be ignored after the crisis, then the idea that if they produced that same advice before the crisis wouldn't have happened, I think is a bit incredible. So I think, again, one needs to think about the knowledge transmission mechanism. What was it that led policymakers to ignore the increase in leverage that occurred, to kind of imagine that everything would be all right? Was it because they were getting wrong advice from economists? I suspect not. I suspect they were under pressure from the financial sector, and the financial sector said, this time is different, it's going to be fine. And of course they were wrong. Okay, let me come to the present and what I mainly want to talk about, which is Keynesian macroeconomics. We talked about labels and how the IMK is sometimes labeled the Trade Unions Institute, or one that backs ideas of trade unions. To call Keynesian economics Keynesian kind of does the same thing. It kind of suggests it's a particular kind of macroeconomics, as opposed to lots of other macroeconomics. But I want to argue that Keynesian economics is actually mainstream economics, macroeconomics. But it's always been controversial on the right, on the political right. And indeed, if you look at how Keynesian economics started, or how it progressed after the war, the first US textbook that tried to incorporate the ideas of the general theory was banned in the US, effectively, and was a failure as a result, because it was felt to be far too left-wing. And that antagonism comes from those who you would call elsewhere, neoliberals, here you would call them ordoliberals, who saw the idea that Keynesians had that you needed to intervene in the economy to keep things going well as somehow ideas that were far too controversial. Not everyone on the right, of course, thought that way. Friedman well understood that you did require state intervention to ensure that either there wasn't too much demand, which would lead to inflation, or there was insufficient demand, which would lead to a recession and unemployment. And he largely used the macroeconomics of the general theory in the advice that he gave. But others on the right have been much more antagonistic. And for macroeconomics, that became critical with what's called the new classical revolution, associated with people like Sargent and Lewis. In the 1980s, Lucas, not Lewis, in the 1980s, who brought lots of new ideas to macroeconomics, but wanted to overturn Keynesian theory. And the important thing to say is that although they did bring lots of, I think, valuable ideas to macroeconomic theory, I'm not a heterodox economist, I think of myself very much as a mainstream economist, they brought lots of new ideas, lots of new ways of doing things. In their attempt to overthrow Keynesian theory, they failed. And how do I know that? Well, I know that for lots of reasons. If you look at textbooks that every undergraduate learns from, you will find Keynesian theory right there, right at the beginning, at its heart, in terms of the macroeconomics that's taught. And those are textbooks that are even used in Germany. And that's because it is mainstream macroeconomics. I don't have any surveys other than in the UK and the US, and they don't happen very often, but when people are asked about, in the US, for example, about the Obama stimulus, was that a good idea to try and stimulate the economy using fiscal policy? In 2009, only 5% of economists asked think it wasn't. In the UK, we have a similar theory, and slightly different context. Was George Osborne's austerity program, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Again, only 15% of economists asked thought it was a good thing. And that's because they're all thinking in Keynesian terms, or nearly all of them. But the main reason why I want to argue that new Keynesian economics, or Keynesian economics, is very much mainstream macroeconomics is if you ask who's doing the state intervention most of the time, it's actually central banks. They are, after all, part of the state. And they're intervening all the time to stabilize the economy. And what models do they use to do that? They use new Keynesian models. They're the basis of the models they use to forecast the economy and to do policy work as well. The implications of this new Keynesian model, when it comes to fiscal policy, some of you will know very well, but it's worth spelling out, and that is you have a temporary reduction in government spending that is likely to have a large impact on output, with a multiplier that could well be greater than 1, assuming a given level of interest rates. Now, in what we used to think of normal times, when interest rates weren't stuck at some lower bound, then you didn't need to worry about that so much, because monetary policy could always offset the impact of fiscal changes. So if we had austerity, then interest rates could be cut to boost demand and bring the economy back to some sensible level of unemployment and employment. But there are two key examples of when monetary policy can't do that. The first is for an individual member of a monetary union, which doesn't have its own monetary policy. In that case, cuts in government spending will lead to falls in output in that economy. And the second case in which that general idea that monetary policy will offset fiscal policy changes does not apply is if interest rates are stuck at their lower bound. If you have cuts in government spending in that case, that will again increase unemployment. Monetary policy can do very little about it. What that means is that if you study fiscal policy in the past and come up with cases in which there was austerity, but the economy did fine, the first thing you should say is, well, what happened to monetary policy during that period? It might have done fine because monetary policy was able to offset the impact of fiscal consolidation. And if you don't ask that, if you just look at past episodes and say, hey, austerity is going to be fine, then you're being very misleading. Okay, so that's what I want to suggest to you is mainstream macroeconomic theory, which happens to be Keynesian. Why was that ignored? Well, I think it was ignored on two occasions, not just very recently. It was ignored when the architecture of the Eurozone was being put together. It's well understood in macroeconomic analysis what the costs and benefits of a common currency are. And really the only major cost is the fact that individual countries lose an independent monetary policy. But the same analysis tells you that the costs of losing your own monetary policy can to some extent be offset if you have a very active counter-cyclical fiscal policy at a national level. Now, sometimes people say, oh, well, you can't have that and also gradually bring down deficit and debt levels, if that's what you want to do. That is nonsense. It is perfectly possible to have a very simple fiscal rule which both brings down debt and deficits gradually over time, but also responds in a counter-cyclical way to, for example, differences in inflation rates between the national economy and the Eurozone as a whole. But as I said, that analysis was ignored when the Stability and Growth Pact was being put together. And that was important as a major contributor to the Eurozone crisis. If the kind of rules that I have in mind that come from mainstream macro analysis had been put in place back in 2000, where the Eurozone was formed, then as certain periphery countries experienced a boom, which meant their inflation rate was higher than the average inflation rate persistently over years, they would have had a much tighter fiscal policy. That would mean that competitiveness imbalances between the periphery countries and the Eurozone average would have been much less by the time we came to the Great Recession. The opposite actually would have applied to Germany, which had persistently lower inflation than the average. That would have meant that come 2010, perhaps we still would have had a Eurozone crisis, but periphery countries' fiscal position would have been in much better shape than it actually was. And also these competitiveness imbalances would have been smaller. But I find it, as macroeconomists love puzzles, but one of the big puzzles to me is, okay, why was this ignored in 2000? I don't know, but it has something to do with the knowledge transmission mechanism. But what's really puzzling is when the Eurozone crisis came along and people said what had gone wrong, hardly anyone suggested that this is what had gone wrong. Okay, so that's the first time that mainstream macroeconomic analysis was ignored. The second time, which you've probably already guessed, is the actual reaction in 2010 of policy to the crisis. And just to remind you, it's textbook macro that when you're in what economists call a liquidity trap, when interest rates are stuck at the zero lower bound, you try and avoid reducing deficits and government debt until interest rates have risen above the zero bound. So you want to be in a position where monetary policy can offset austerity. So it's not saying don't do austerity, it's just saying wait until the right time. But this consensus, macroeconomic consensus, was ignored, not just in the Eurozone, but in the US, in the UK in 2010. My puzzle is, why was this? Now, no doubt some politicians had ulterior motives. They wanted to reduce the size of the state or whatever, and this was a clever way of doing it by the back door. some politicians picked very unrepresentative bits of macroeconomic research, I've named a couple there, which didn't correspond with mainstream analysis, but which suited the position they wanted to take. One said that if debt levels go above 90%, the world will come to an end. That study really didn't survive close inspection, and the fact that Japan seems to be quite happy with debt levels above 90% was just cast aside. Another study said, you can have austerity, it'll be expansionary. Well, it wasn't expansionary. But were those policymakers deliberately choosing unrepresentative bits of macroeconomics, or were they being advised that this was serious bits of macroeconomic analysis? Did they know, in a sense, that they were going against the mainstream? Okay, so let me talk about the knowledge transmission mechanism. But before I do, just say why I want to talk about this rather than macroeconomic theory. In a sense, perhaps I should just talk about the things I really know, which is macroeconomic theory. But I want to talk about the knowledge transmission mechanism because the costs of ignoring this mainstream macroeconomic advice has been huge. I've got a list there of studies, a couple of which are IMK studies, which have looked at the costs, but it's not as if these are just picked out of lots of others that suggested the costs were small. These are the studies that have been done, and I don't really know of any independent studies which have come to very different conclusions. And they suggest that the austerity that began in 2010 has had a huge effect on output on GDP. We have lost at least 10% of GDP in terms of resources as a result of this policy move. And just to reinforce the point, standard macroeconomic theory says that these costs could have been largely avoided if we delayed austerity until interest rates were above their zero lower bound. So why? Why is mainstream macro theory being ignored? Now, I think I want to mention lots of potential reasons here, and this won't be a complete list at all. I do need to mention the media. We've already talked about certain housewives. I agree that sometimes those housewives are misrepresented. But nevertheless, again, to pick up on an earlier point, for your journalist who doesn't know much economics, let alone macroeconomics, the idea of the analogy of a government with a household is a powerful one, and it's a very easy one to slip back to. But as every economic student is taught within a year of doing an undergraduate degree, it's an analogy which is wrong or can be wrong. I don't know how important this has been in Germany, but in the UK and the US it's been very important, and that is economists from the financial sector and the advice they give. In a way, it's natural for the media to go to economists working in the financial sector because those economists say, oh, look, we're close to the markets. And of course, the problems you're having are problems with the markets. So I know what the market is thinking. Well, of course, they don't. They'd be very rich if they did, but they don't. But they also have vested interests. And as many people who know those markets well have said to me, bond economists never saw a fiscal tightening that they didn't like. So those economists always say, yes, it's a good idea to tighten fiscal policy. Civil servants, well, I have actually been involved once in a piece of knowledge transmission mechanism which I thought worked really very well. And that was when Gordon Brown had to decide in 2003 whether the UK should join the Eurozone. And he knew he had to make that decision, so at least a year, probably more, before that, he asked his civil servants to give him all the background information, all the background knowledge there was, so he could make a good decision. So they had over a year, and those civil servants, they weren't given a direction. They won't say, oh, make sure you find the right result. They said, just find the analysis for me. And they spent over a year asking all kinds of economists, all kinds of questions about was a monetary union a good idea, and when should you join it, when you shouldn't. And they did a really good job of looking at what macroeconomists were saying, what was a minority view and what was a majority view, and they put it all together. Most of the time, civil servants do not get that luxury. Most of the time, it's a crisis and they have to respond within days. And therefore, it's very important that they have in-house lots of economic knowledge. And perhaps in places where macroeconomic stabilization has been in the hands of a central bank for many, many years, they've not had economists who need to worry about those issues in-house that much. Instead, their focus has been on microeconomic issues to do with tax, public spending, and generally trying to stop other ministries spending too much. And therefore, they haven't had the expertise to realize when it's a good idea to have austerity and when it's not. And maybe if, when the Eurozone was set up, national economies had been encouraged to do countercyclical policy, maybe that expertise might be there, but perhaps it isn't. But all of that is a bit speculative. In a sense, I think the main thing that I want to talk about in terms of failure of the knowledge transmission mechanism is the role of central banks. As I've already said, one reason I know that Keynesian macroeconomics, new Keynesian models are mainstream is they're used by the economists in central banks to forecast the economy, to say what interest rates should be. But when it came to the recent crisis, the advice coming from senior central bankers couldn't have been more different. It varies a lot when you look at different central banks. In the US, we probably had the best response from a macroeconomic point of view, which was just to say nothing for a long time. Eventually, Ben Bernanke did say, austerity isn't very helpful for what I'm trying to do, but he did it very quietly and rather reluctantly. So some central banks just think they shouldn't talk about fiscal policy at all because they don't want politicians to talk about monetary policy. In other countries, including my own, central bankers did give advice, and their advice was austerity was a good idea. And why is this? When the models that they're using suggest otherwise. And I think Mervyn King, used to be governor of the Bank of England, said something very clear on this. He said, central banks are often accused of being obsessed by inflation. This is wrong. If they're obsessed by anything, it's fiscal policy. Why? Because I think in every central banker, or nearly every central banker, there's a deep-seated concern about what economists call fiscal dominance. There's a deep-seated concern that if budget deficits get too large, then central banks will be forced to monetize, and therefore there will be inflation. And I think that concern is to some extent a rather old-fashioned and certainly in today's world inappropriate one. But I think it leads central banks to do two things which have been very unhelpful in the latest crisis. First, it leads them to overestimate their own abilities to deal with stabilizing the economy, even when interest rates are at their zero lower bound. So in the UK, for example, I think there was far too much optimism about quantitative easing. And we can see it now in terms of many people think, oh, now the Eurozone has quantitative easing, everything is going to be fine. Actually, everything might be a bit better, but people are going to ignore the fact that actually austerity in the Eurozone has also been slowing down, and that might be the reason why everything is getting a bit better. The other thing they do is to downplay, underestimate, or just ignore the deflationary dangers arising from fiscal austerity. And so, as a result, we see something which is really a paradox for me. And that is we see one particular central bank, I'll leave you to guess which one, finding itself incapable of stabilizing the economy. Unemployment's been going up, inflation is now going down below zero, and yet still arguing that there should be more austerity, making their job even more difficult than it obviously already is. And that is a deep paradox, and perhaps can be partly explained by some of the things I mentioned today. Okay, so just to summarize what I've been trying to say, I think some macroeconomic crises can simply be explained by bad macroeconomic theory. The Great Depression maybe is one of them. But other crises where people have tried to tell that very simple story, it's much less convincing. If we think about recent events, it's totally unconvincing because what we've had are crises that to a large extent have come because politicians have ignored mainstream macroeconomic theory. And that's had huge costs. And to try and understand why that's happened, I think we need to think about what I've called the knowledge transmission mechanism, and in particular, looking at what happened since 2010, the role of central banks in that knowledge transmission mechanism. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Wren-Lewis. As far as I've understood, you mean that mainstream economics has to have more power in politics. Is it right? Or more influence, let's say. Influence.
Yeah. What I don't want to appear to say is that everything is great with macroeconomics. Obviously, there are lots of issues, lots of problems. Macroeconomic theory could be a lot better. What I'm saying is, if we look at what's really gone wrong in the last few years, it's not the fault of macroeconomic theory and macroeconomic academics. It's because policymakers have been ignoring us. Yes.